Simulation and racing are two of my all-time favourite genres of gaming, if you can even call it that. Combine the two together and you end up with a pretty happy me. Welcome to Total Reviews, the web show where we take a look at games of interest and see if they really are worth a purchase, in partnership with Games Planet, where you can purchase games like our choice today at a discounted rate from an officially licensed game seller. Today's episode is all about Project Cars Game of the Year Edition, the simulator or game by Slightly Mad Studios. First released in May 2015, Project Cars is a simulation-style racing game that sets out to redefine the genre and bring it into the next generation of graphics, sounds and physics, and is available on PC, PS4 and Xbox One. The latest version of the Game of the Year Edition, includes all previous DLC over the year, bringing the total number of cars to 125, up 50 from normal, 100 plus tracks at 35 locations, up 4, over 60 new liveries created by the community, and a whole raft of improvements and features. In addition to that, this version of the game also has the Nürburgring Nordschleife in its 24-hour layout with the GP circuit and two Pagani vehicles, the Zonda Revolution and the Huayra BC. PC specs recommend that you have an Intel i7 quad-core running at 3.5 GHz or an AMD FX 8350 at 4 GHz, as well as 8 GB of RAM and a decent upper mid-range graphics card to run smoothly. But don't worry if you don't have all of that, since it will run on lesser hardware. As long as you have a quad-core at a decent clock speed, 4 GB of RAM and an NVIDIA GTX 260 or equivalent, then you should be okay at minimum settings. But that really is not where Project Cars would shine. In addition, be prepared to sacrifice about 25 GB of hard drive or SSD space. There are also VR modes available, which need to be selected before starting the game, for both Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, so if you have those, you can get a different experience out of this game, but I won't be checking that because I don't have any of those, and plus I think it would make a really dodgy review, so let's not do that right now. Upon entering the game, I was treated to a very long intro video which went about showing off all various cars, locations and effects in game. Nothing wrong with that, they worked hard on making things sound and look good, so why not? That is the video you've been watching so far, and it did raise my expectations somewhat for the game. I was then introduced to, what should we name her? Hannah. She's the voice in your head as you navigate your way through the menus and races for the first time, and despite having a pleasant enough tone, she gets very annoying very quickly. As usual, my first task was to work out what options were available. The music was a little loud and I wanted to reduce it. Problem was that with my wheel, I couldn't work out how to get to an option screen. The arrow keys didn't seem to move to the next screen, but after a little bit of playing around, I worked out that pressing the paddles actually moved over to another menu screen. I didn't even know that the mouse worked at that point. Apparently it did, but it didn't have there was no mouse cursor available since it picked up my wheel. Options seemed plentiful and I was very impressed with it all. As you know, I like it when there are dozens of options because that means that it can cater to many different types of systems, expanding the reach of the games. The gameplay options were impressive, solidifying the simulation marketing of the game, at least so far. My first issue with navigating the menus was when I was attempting to customize the game controls. No matter what I did, I could not get to the other control settings, and like I said before, since I couldn't see a mouse, I was not aware you could even use one. You can. I then decided to take a look at the garage to see what cars were available. Though there is not as vast a range as, say, Forza or Gran Turismo, the cars seemed highly detailed and were from various classes. I did note the lack of road cars though, with most being GT, LMP or open wheel cars. There's definitely a load of those, and there is an entire Lotus Formula 1 pack, so expect a whole bunch of Lotus cars, or Loti. We've had this conversation before in another video a long time ago. After tootling around for a bit, I decided to see if I could set up a bit of free practice to actually get into the main point of the game / sim, the driving. Dynamic weather could be set up beforehand if needed, which I found pretty cool, as well as the time of day and progression of time and weather. Once set up, which was relatively painless, I got settled and prepared myself to take out the Ford Focus RS out on the track at Catalonia. Reason I chose that combination is because I know how the car drove and I know the track extremely well. Once on track though, I was a slight bit disappointed that it was auto drive out of the pits, but it's not really a big deal as it was only for a few seconds, but I would have liked manual control in and out of the pits. That would have been quite fancy. As soon as I was switched over to manual control though, I felt the wheel feel really heavy in my hands, almost like the car was running with no power steering. It threw me off quite significantly, but as I started driving, I felt that there was at least some bumps in the road that were being fed back to the wheel, but I couldn't feel too much. I couldn't feel too many bumps, and I could barely feel the rumble strips. But ignoring that for now, I'll come back to that. I was fairly impressed with the visuals. They had a very shiny look to them, and the god rays did look rather spectacular. Models looked accurate both in the cars and tracks. I was not a big fan of some of the trackside objects. They seemed to break the immersion, at least a little for me. But that's more so a personal gripe with any game or simulator that does that. Forza is notorious for their odd trackside objects. Sounds for me were the first place that Project Cars started to show some holes. Some cars sounded quite good and made you feel like you were actually in the car. Then there were others that sounded really dull and lifeless. And then a third that sounded over-exaggerated. The Toyota GT86 was a prime example of the over-exaggerated sounds. I've heard these cars in various games and simulators as well as in real life. And this car clearly showed an over-exaggeration. The same ran for many cars, whilst others seemed muffled, but the cars that sounded right were great. It was just a shame that they probably accounted for roughly 50% of the cars I tried. As all of you are aware, often the greatest aspect of simulation boils down to physics and interactions. Interactions were certainly there before you got into the car, with loads of setup options on the cars, right down to the liveries. Suspension tuning, gear ratios, all of that was available. That's exactly what you expect from a simulation. Speaking of liveries though, Project Cars Game of the Year edition comes with some extra out-of-the-box Logitech liveries. It's quite interesting to know. It's a little bit of sponsorship I suppose there, but back to the whole simulation aspect. When it comes down to physics, this is sadly not a simulation. This feels more like a simcade game. Part simulation, part arcade. Think Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsports, two of the biggest simcade games out there. Stick them next to the likes of Need for Speed, and they are clearly a more serious genre of game, superior physics and racing etiquette. Similar goes for the Formula 1 series. It's more simcade. There are a lot of simulation aspects in there, but if you stick those against the likes of R Factor, Assetto Corsa, iRacing, they tend to pale in comparison. Project Cars fits very well in that bracket. It's by no means a bad game, at least now that a number of bugs have been ironed out, but it is not a simulator, or at least at a simulation standard for me. And the developers have no intention of making it that. The slogan for the game was something like for racers by racers, or developed by racers for racers. But in all the time I played it, it just didn't seem to be that. Yes, it was ahead of the likes of GT and Forza in quite a few many ways, but it lagged behind drastically on driving physics to the other simulators on the market. It was wrapped in a very pretty shell, but you know, having 12K resolution options, VR and multi-class racing does not make it a simulator. It makes it a game with some pretty cool features. Going back to the actual driving, the force feedback I mentioned earlier, it was really bad. The cars felt as though they had no power steering like I mentioned, and you barely got a sense of the road from it. It wasn't a good experience. Of course, maybe an hour or two of tweaking would have got it better, but the fact that it recognized my wheels straight away and then gave it feedback like that disappointed me. And then we get to the AI. Now, I'm pretty used to some shambolic AI. A number of games have them, but this AI was really bad at times. They were all over the place, and they seemed to have no intention of stopping when you spun in front of them. They'd just happily plow along, leaving you in an endless spin. Not a pleasant experience, I tell you that. On the other hand, I quite liked the weather and time of day effects. They worked well, and the weather looked fairly good in the simulator. On top of that, frame rates were very stable for me, regardless of whether I was running on my own in a sparsely populated track with 20 cars on a heavy graphics one. It was still running happily over 60 frames per second, or at 60 frames per second for me. This showed a decently optimized game, which is very important in this day and age, especially with the computers you get and the amount of processing that's going on. It was very well optimized. Put it this way, Project Cars was giving me frames that I sometimes can't even get on Dirt Rally. So that's a way to put it into perspective. I think it was fairly well optimized. So that's a definite plus point for it. Overall, Project Cars is a decent title to have if you're a casual racer who wants to get perhaps a little more into the simulation, but still wants to have a whole bunch of slidey, arcadey style fun. It's a definite competitor to the more established titles out there, particularly on the PlayStation and Xbox systems, but it falls short of being a proper simulator with physics that just do not seem to add up and sounds that are a bit hit and miss. Nevertheless, if you're looking for a decent racing game with a fair amount of cars and some simulation aspects, Project Cars may be right up your alley with a solid 75 out of 100 from me. But for those of you more serious about simulation, you may want to look elsewhere for your fix.